full today, but they'll be made. Great, thanks, Sarah. They'll be made available to you after today's webinar is done. So you can look for those resources when they are ready. And just a final note before we move on here into the summary, you may have noticed I am an attorney. We are talking about regulations today, but this is not legal advice. And so there are a number of things we'll be touching on today that probably do need to be run by your counsel for your institution, especially when you're making decisions around some of these things like what's your point in time of initial enrollment, what is going to be included in your student location policy or things that will be excluded. So some particular things that can create risks for your institution, you'll want to make sure that you are thoroughly evaluating those risks before you're making decisions around this. So not legal advice for me, but I'm most happy to share what I know and what I've been learning from other institutions as we've been working together on this. All right, so what is required? Let me go into this summary, and you'll notice in the slides that I'm presenting here, I'm not putting up the language directly from the regulations. That is kind of on purpose. So I know that we can, it's overwhelming sometimes to look at the regulation language itself. And often, frankly, especially with these, it's just confusing because some of the language the Department of Ed has included is not exactly clear on what they mean or what they're asking for here. So in the slides, you're going to see information that's coming from the regulations, but also the commentary that the Department of Education released with those final regulations, plus some additional communication from the Department of Education staff as they've been kind of slowly sharing their expectations around these new regulations and what's required. Again, you'll get a copy of the slide deck, so you'll have access to those regulations if you haven't seen them yourself. But breaking this down, so what are these new requirements? What are we talking about? When we talk to institutions, we really like to highlight these three responsibilities that institutions have related to this work. Again, in particular, under the federal Title IV regulations. So first is you need to understand if your programs related to a professional or occupational license meet the educational requirements for that license. And I'm going to get into details on all three of these, but that's the first one is really you need to have an understanding of how your programs are meeting educational requirements or not in other states and territories. Second one is you need to certify that your programs do meet those educational requirements wherever you're enrolling students. So wherever your students are located, you need to be able to certify that the programs meet those educational requirements. And then the third responsibility is related to communicating that information. So communicating your understanding. This one has been around since 2020. So the communicating responsibility related to public and direct disclosures, really not a whole lot of substantive changes from the existing requirements, which again went into effect July 1st of 2020. But we will dig into this one still and make sure that people understand what's going on with this communication responsibility that still exists even after July 1st of this year. All right, so let's focus on that first responsibility. You need to understand how your licensure programs meet educational requirements for licensure in each state and territory where you're enrolling students or recruiting for that program or advertising that program. So there's a lot packed into that one statement. Let's dig into each of these a little bit more here. First off, what do we mean by licensure programs? Licensure in and of itself is more of an umbrella kind of term here, which really means any sort of state or territory government issued credential that's required to work in a profession or occupation. So if you have something called a endorsement, certificate, authorization, registration, all of those things can be licensure or a license for these purposes. If it's something that's issued by a state or territory government entity, usually a licensing board or agency that is responsible for overseeing that particular profession or occupation. If that state issued thing is required to work in that field, whatever that occupation or profession is, then that's licensure or a license for these purposes. So I'm going to keep saying license and licensure throughout the presentation today, but just keep in mind that that's really kind of more encompassing term than just license. It can include things that are called something else: certification, endorsement, authorization, etc. So then what's a licensure program? Well, unfortunately, we don't have a list or anything that's been provided by US Department of Education or otherwise. So it really is ultimately up to each of you, your institutions, to figure out what is a licensure program. So we don't have a list that's available, but what we do have is some guidance or some color here from Department of Education that gives us criteria for when we're looking at our programs to help us decide. First off, is the program designed to prepare a student for a license? So has that curriculum been built around standards? Was that part of the framework of things that were being evaluated when you were designing that program, that you wanted to prepare students for a particular license? If the answer is yes, then it's probably a licensure program. Another thing to keep in mind, are you advertising that program as leading to a license or to some sort of outcome, employment outcome that would require a license? So understanding that licensure programs, again, is not defined by Department of Ed. We don't have a list from them. It's up to you to decide, and you're going to want to use that criteria of is it designed or is it advertised to lead to a license? All right, so again, I'm just unpacking that first statement here on this slide, and there's quite a bit. Real quick, wanted to touch on that recruiting or advertising point here. So recruiting and advertising, if you're doing that in other states outside of Illinois, you will want to know that and know where you're recruiting for these specific licensure programs or advertising these specific licensure programs, because Department of Education staff have indicated that their expectation is institutions are only recruiting and advertising in states where they meet the educational requirements for licensure. So if you have specific recruiting and advertising happening outside of Illinois for a particular licensure program, you're going to need to know where that's happening and then make sure that it is a state or territory where you meet the educational requirements. All right. A little bit more here on this understanding responsibility before I move on. This does apply to all types of programs, all modes of delivery. So we still hear quite a bit of confusion around this, where some people think this only applies to distance education programs. That is not true. These regulations apply equally to all types of programs. There's a connection with distance education for the new certify responsibility, which I'll get into in a moment. But again, keep in mind, this applies to all modes of delivery, all types of programs. And you do need to have that understanding if your program meets or does not meet the educational requirements. You'll note the last bullet here on the slide. There's kind of this third categorization that exists today under the 2020 regulations, where maybe you've not determined or you haven't tried to make a determination if your program meets educational requirements. Under the 2020 version, that could be used more broadly. It would apply more broadly because you can disclose that, right? That's part of one of the possibilities under public disclosures today is you can list that you haven't determined for a particular state or territory. That's changing for 2024, and I'll get into that communicating responsibility here shortly. But wanted to point out that it could still make sense that an institution would have some states or territories where they're not determined. And that could be okay to keep that understanding, at least for the short term, or maybe even potentially longer, depending on the particular scenario for how you're offering the program, where your students are located, and where you're recruiting and advertising.
Chris, I know we're going to have time for questions coming up. You have a couple more slides, but would you just, there's a question about advertising. And I know this comes up quite a bit. It's a good question. If a program is on your site, then aren't you technically advertising it outside Illinois?
Yeah, like on your website, just in general. Yeah. So this recruiting and advertising piece, again, is not spelled out in the regulation itself. It's not even really clearly flushed out in the commentary that Department of Ed provided. It's coming from Department of Ed staff. And so we're hoping that Department of Education will be releasing soon, maybe even this week, some written guidance that further clarifies things around this new regulation, including this notion of advertising and recruiting and exactly what they mean by that, what they're potentially trying to place limitations on. I will say, from what I've received email communication from Department of Ed staff and others I know, it really seems to be focused on a particular licensure program. So if you're specifically advertising a program and or recruiting students from other states, and not generally just sharing information, right? So I don't think the department is trying to shut down your ability to have a licensure program up on your website. I think it's more about targeted efforts in particular states and territories. But again, hoping that Department of Ed will clarify that in any kind of written guidance that should be coming out very soon. All right, so let's shift gears here into the second responsibility related to this around certify. This is the new big thing coming online for July 1st of this year, and it's related to the program participation agreement, which is basically the master contract that every institution needs to sign with the US Department of Education in order to be eligible to participate in the Title IV program. So in order for your students to be able to access, student loans, other Title IV aid, you have to agree to this PPA. The PPA is not new. It's been around for a long time. It has a lot of things that your institution must agree to do or not do. So what's new is the department is adding this section that's specific to professional and occupational licensure. And starting again this July 1st, every institution must certify that any program you're offering that prepares students for licensure or whatever it's called, certification, endorsement, etc., that it meets the educational requirements where your institution is located, so Illinois for all of you, and where your students are located at the time of initial enrollment in that licensure program. Now, there is an exception the department has created here. If you have someone, a student, or I should say potential student, who's located in a state or territory where your program does not meet the educational requirements or where you don't know, you haven't made a determination, you could still enroll them as long as they go through a process where you're explaining kind of what the limitations are and where they then provide a written attestation that says, I intend to seek license and employment in a meets state. And they would have to name the particular state where your program does meet. So it could be Illinois, or it could be some other state or territory where you've determined that that program meets the educational requirements. We don't have a prescriptive form or again, really details from Department of Education around what this written attestation needs to be or what it needs to include. But we do have some rough guidance or some rough guidelines around that. So it does need to be a written statement that will be retained in that student's record. The institution would need to make that available to the Department of Education should they ever ask for it. And it would need to clearly indicate that that student plans to seek a license and employment in a particular meets state after they complete your program. So those are kind of the bare bones, like, again, the guidelines around it. There are other things that you'll want to consider as part of your process for, how you're introducing this written attestation to students and how you're securing that. And we have provided some examples that are, again, just kind of a rough shot at this, right? It's not meant to be a template for you to replicate. Every institution will need to come up with your own process and your own actual written attestation form, if you will, what that's going to look like at your institution. So you'll have those available to you after today when the materials from this webinar are available. I do want to just pause here briefly, if you can go back for one moment, Nan. Sorry, I wanted to touch on student location. So we also will have some examples of student location policies available. Obviously, with this new requirement, it's connected to where your students are located. And if you haven't been involved in this work much before, it may seem like well, it's kind of obvious where students are located, but it's actually up to your institution to have a student location policy in place that you're applying consistently at your institution, and that policy is being reviewed and updated as needed as part of your regular policy processes. So if you don't know if you have a student location policy in place that's being used for licensure purposes, that's something that'll be important to get to work on pretty quickly, investigating what that is and potentially updating it in light of this new certify responsibility. Because again, you can only enroll students if they're located in a MEETS state or territory, or if you secure that written attestation from them as part of that admission or enrollment process. All right, so moving on then to this third responsibility related to this, it's around communicating. And as I mentioned, not a whole lot has changed from the 2020 requirements to these new July 1, 2024 requirements. There are a couple of things which I'll point out here, but you still are obligated to have public disclosures in place. So these are typically going to be on an institution's website. You probably have something up today, hopefully, for all of your licensure programs where you're listing states where you've determined that your programs meet the educational requirements. Maybe there's some states where you do not meet. And then you probably have a third category, that not determined or no determination made. And it could be a pretty big list in there, places where you haven't made a determination yet. That's totally in compliance with the 2020 regulations that we're under today. There are some changes coming for this July. So US Department of Ed has removed that third category as a requirement under the public disclosures. So institutions are no longer obligated to list out those states and territories where you've not made a determination. What you are obligated to list are those states and territories where you've made a determination that your program meets, and those places where you've made the determination that your program does not meet. So you need to have at a minimum that meets list and does not meet for each of your licensure programs on your public disclosures. We know that some institutions are planning to continue having that third categorization, the not determined or no determination made. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that in the regulation. It's just no longer required after July 1. And keep in mind, though, that that list for not determined could need to be quite a bit shorter than what it is today. So if you've got Illinois listed as meets and maybe a couple border states, and then 50 plus something in your not determined, you may need to make those not determineds as part of your other list here. And that's because, again, you need to be able, around recruiting and advertising, the department's expectation seems to be that you are only doing those activities for those programs where you know that the program meets the educational requirements. So if you have specific advertising for that licensure program or specific recruiting efforts for that program happening in other states, then you would need to make sure that that is on your meets list in order to be doing those activities. I did want to note here that we have a connection to SARA policy. So State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement Policy 5.2 has been around for a while. It's actually connected to the current 2020 version of the licensure disclosure regulations under federal Title IV. There are a couple of things to note here that are in, again, this is current existing SARA policy that's been in place. If you're disclosing through your public disclosures that you've not determined or there's no determination made about a state or territory, SARA policy says you should first be making all reasonable efforts to make a determination before you do that. And then if it's still not determined or no determination made, you should provide the board contact information to students or prospective students that lets them know how to get in touch with that board or agency and encourage them to go try to make that determination themselves. I know SARA policy is in the midst of a policy modification process review, and I do know that there have been some submissions around this, either to change some things with the existing policy or to align it a little better with this new July 1, 2024 version. So we'll want to keep tabs on that as that policy modification process moves along this year, which a final version will not be available until after July 1st. So there will be this kind of time frame where we could have SARA policy a little bit mismatched from the federal regulations. All right, so last point here around communicating is for individual direct disclosures. Again, these have been around since 2020, so hopefully your institution already has a process in place where you've been notifying prospective students or applicants if they're located in a does not meet or not determined state or territory, that you've let them know that by sending an email or something in writing to them prior to that initial enrollment. I will note that initial enrollment is another important term here that we don't have a dictated point in time or a specific definition provided by Department of Education. We kind of have some rough guidelines here. So initial enrollment means the student has made some sort of significant financial commitment to your institution. So any point before they do that, before they're initially enrolled in the program, you would need to send this individual direct disclosure if they're located and it does not meet or not determined. And then for your current students, you have 14 calendar days to send them this direct disclosure if something changes and they're now in a does not meet situation. So maybe the student moves, right? They change their location. Maybe something happens and a state changes their educational requirements, and or something changes with your program, and now you're in a does not meet scenario. You have to notify all students that are in that location where now it does not meet within 14 calendar days. You'll notice that for these direct disclosures, right, I've referenced students' location a few times. So again, you should have a policy that you've been using for these purposes, but student location is going to be even more critical with that new certify responsibility that's starting this July 1st. All right, so I've got one other slide here for us before we dig in and open up the floor officially to questions. But this is around the Department of Education's electronic announcement that went out a couple of weeks ago. So you may have seen this from other sources. Basically, what the department's doing is opening, at least in a small crack here, a window of opportunity for some institutions that are in very unique situations where something outside of their control is preventing them from complying with that new PPA certification responsibility by July 1st. So if an institution's in a scenario where they're waiting for something from a licensing board, like if there is some sort of official review or approval process, and that's going to drag out beyond July 1st, the institution would need to document all of that very thoroughly. And then you could use that as a defense to an enforcement action by the Department of Education, should they bring one against your institution between July 1st and January 1st of 2025. So the key takeaways from this is Department of Ed has not delayed the effective date. These regulations are still effective for July 1st. Again, they apply to all of your licensure programs, no matter the modality, however they're being delivered, to all institutions. So they're not delaying the effective date. And also, this is only applicable to the new PPA certification requirement. So that new certify responsibility, it does not apply to the public or direct disclosures. So if you think that this may fit some, again, pretty unique time-specific criteria where something's completely outside of the control of your institution, then you would want to look into this further and consult with your counsel and see if it makes sense for you to be documenting all these things to potentially have it ready, again, in the case that there's an enforcement action between July 1st and January 1st. All right, so time for questions. I think I saw some things coming through chat. I don't know if we have any questions there yet, or again, feel free to ask the question on video or audio here too, if you'd prefer.
Chris, we have a question in the chat. Would pre-professional bachelor's degrees an example is meeting requirements for vet school applications be included?
If we're talking about a pre-professional, a pre-licensure program, then no, because we're going to, again, kind of go back to that criteria, right? Is the program designed to prepare a student to be eligible for a license when they complete the program? So that particular program, or is it being advertised as leading to a particular license? I think for these pre-licensure, it can get a little confusing, right? Because, well, yeah, it's designed to prepare someone to get them ready for a licensure program, but you want to connect that actual program to what that has been designed to do and what it's being advertised or marketed towards. So typically, a pre-licensure program is not going to meet the criteria.
Not sure if we had someone who wanted to go off mute and ask. Anyone?
Yeah, sure. I'll give it a try. I know this is probably a silly question, but so we have a licensure program, and let's say that we have 3 students from a state that we didn't expect. How do we go find those to make sure that we're meeting their requirements? Because as I recall, we use the SARA compact to define those clinical arrangements that occur outside of an area if the student lives in a certain area. But I was just wondering if there was guidance from somewhere that told us, sure, you can go apply for this. How do we know if it does not meet? I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's a great question, Robert. This is really one of the labor intensive parts of all of this work. So, the only way to know if your programs meet the education requirements in other states is to go out and research what those requirements are in other states and territories, which typically you need to start with looking at the law itself because licensure is governed, at the state level. Each state gets to decide, are we going to regulate that particular profession or occupation? And if we are, what are the requirements going to be to qualify for that license or certification or whatever it is? So you would need to have someone at your institution go out and research those other states, what if they have a license in that area, what it is, and then what the specific requirements are, and then compare your actual program, so the classes, any field experience or practicum or internship, student teaching, compare everything you're offering to those educational requirements to see if it actually could satisfy it or not, if it meets it or not. That's kind of a very simple way of talking about it. I'm happy to dig in more if you want to, but there are some places to help you get started maybe. So if you think about the profession, if there's a national association for that profession, oftentimes they'll have links directly to the state and territory licensing boards. So that's a good starting point. Some of those state and territory boards themselves have a national organization or association, like the National Council of State Boards of Nursing is an example of this. So their website has quite a bit of helpful information as well. And they also direct you again to that state nursing board for more details. So those are kind of some ways to get started. And then, as I mentioned, this is the time-consuming piece of this work. Really, is doing the research and then having someone who's very familiar with the program actually go in and compare your curriculum to what that state's looking for.
Perfect. Thank you.
I saw Kimberly's hand next. If you want to go ahead.
Okay, I have a question about a program that, well, I'll just be specific about the program. Like we have a master's in occupational therapy that is designed to prepare folks to take the national certification exam. But then there's additional licensure steps in some states. So, so our program's designed to do one thing, and we have, right now our professional disclosures say this is what it does. And here are links to the states about their own licensure requirements. But is this, even though it's designed for the first step, that national certification, which is usually required for most of the second step, is that something we need to address then specifically? And then I actually have a unrelated question, actually.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, Kimberly, right? When we think about requirements for earning a license, there are things that have to be done in a program, and then things that are done outside of the program or that are not even related to education, right? Like think about criminal history, or fingerprinting or CPR training. There are lots of other things. So there are lots of things that make up the ability to be licensed. Usually, exams are a part of that for most of these professions and occupations. And so, oftentimes, you're going to have a program that's been specifically designed to prepare someone, to sit for a particular exam, which could be connected to a national certification. This is a great example because it's a lot of layers to this one here in OT. So, someone's being prepared to sit for that certification exam, but certification is required by most of these states and territories to earn a license, and the license is required in order to actually work as an OT. Like you can't just go work as an OT without having the state issued license. And the state issued license requires the certification, which requires them passing the exam, and you're preparing them to pass that exam, right? So we've got like all of these layers, like I said. I would say OT is definitely a licensed profession. Again, like this is one that is less questionable to me than maybe some others. But because you're preparing your students to sit for that exam, which is a certification exam, but it's also the licensing exam. And I'm guessing that whoever designed and created your program would say, well, yeah, our intention is that our graduates become licensed as OTs so that they can work as an OT in their state. I think this one would definitely be on the licensure program list for most institutions. So then what that means is wherever you have students located, where you're enrolling students from, you would have to be able to say your program meets the educational requirements there, or again, put them through that exception, the written attestation process in order to enroll. As far as the disclosures, I think you referenced, Kimberly, you have information up there now, and you're pointing them like to other websites to find information. You would want to make sure, especially starting this July 1st, that you clearly have a list on your website of states where you've determined that your program meets the educational requirements and states and territories where you've determined it does not meet. And then you can always provide additional information. So it is a good idea probably to direct them right to like the professional association or other potentially helpful websites, but you do need to have that listing in your public disclosures of meets and does not meet in order to satisfy the July 1 regulation changes.
Okay, thank you. We have that for some other fields, but that one we just have, so that's very helpful. I have another question, which is unrelated to that, which is an undergrad program. Like we have, accounting program, which eventually students want to go get a CPA, but that requires more, more semester hours. But because it requires 150 semester hours and not 120 like a bachelor's degree requires, 130, whatever it is. Sorry, like 100. Ours is actually 128, but
Sure.
but it's not designed to do that. It's designed to provide some of the background classes. So it's sort of related to the one with the bachelor's degree where it's sort of a pre-program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As long as it's not related, it's not saying it's going to meet that, is that fine?
Yes, so accounting has been a thorn in a lot of people's sides, especially since these July 1 changes were announced back in October when they released the final regulations. But you're right, all states require 150 semester hours to qualify for the license as a CPA. So to meet the education requirements, somebody has to produce 150 semester hours. And then within that, a particular number of credits of accounting and business, and maybe some other things too, depending on the state. So I don't think that it's likely that very many undergraduate programs in accounting are going to indicate that they've designed their program. So if you have a 150 semester hour bachelor's program, that, you know, you've designed to meet CPA and you're including all those things, then maybe it would still be on a list of licensure programs. But for the most part, these undergraduate programs in accounting are not going to show up or not end up on an institution's list of licensure programs. As long as you are very clear in the advertising and marketing what the program is and isn't designed for, then I think you should be fine with that approach, right? So making sure that students understand, you know, this is this program can be a step in the process, right? So if you want to be a CPA, like you would have to go on and get a graduate degree or do graduate credits in this, making sure that whoever's talking to potential applicants about the programs are also very clear about that when they're talking about it. And I think you would be in good shape there. So it is almost morphing into a pre-licensure program as a way to think about it for those undergraduate programs that you would have in accounting.
Okay, Chris. We have a question and then a few more beyond that, so I'm going to wrap them up together. Here's the main question. Does the Department of Education have any plans to help institutions? For instance, keeping the state board information sites current. States tend to make changes, breaking links without letting folks know. Could the feds curate a list that states need to notify them of changes? And additional is people are asking for guidelines or handbook, so help.
Yeah, yes. I mean, wouldn't that be great if Department of Ed put out some more robust resources and tried to make sure that state licensing boards and agencies had good information available on their website that was clear. Unfortunately, I don't know of any efforts by the Department of Ed to do that. In fact, there's some commentary that they included with the final regs where, you know, basically they're like, well, we can't tell the state licensing boards what to do, which is very frustrating because, you know, all the responsibility is now placed on institutions, right? You have to be able to make a determination that your program meets in order to enroll. But to do that, you have to dig in and research all these other states and territories, and including maybe communicating with these licensing boards and agencies who are very short-staffed and under-resourced themselves. So it's kind of setting up potentially a recipe for disaster in some instances, hopefully not total disaster. But and nonetheless, that's where we're at. So yeah, I don't know of any efforts. I don't see the department releasing like a comprehensive resource anytime soon. Definitely not before July 1st. What they probably will release though is a written guidance document that gives us a little more color and clarity on some of these things, like the advertising restrictions or expectations, maybe even kind of defining some of these licensure programs like accounting. I know they've received a lot of questions about accounting along with engineering and some other particular programs. So we'll have to see what's available. And then Nan, you said people are asking for a guide. I mean, there are resources available. So we have some on our website in the form of blog posts and other things. MHEC has webinars that we've done for them on the July 1st changes up in their past convening pages. If you look for that, that can give you some good information, maybe for starting places as you're just getting your head wrapped around this. If you're a member of WCET's State Authorization Network, WCET SAN, they also have quite a few good resources available for SAN members on their website as well. So anything that I missed, Nan, that you think we should point people to?
Not that I can think of, but I do want to mention I sent the link for the SAN web page that has professional licensure requirements. And I don't believe you need to be a member. I think at least some of them are open to anyone going to that link. And it's also will apply across all states, even though they're a member of a division of WCET. The professional licensure requirements and that handbook and checklist should apply across all states.
Good point. And also to point out an additional resource from us through MEC is we've compiled a listing of state and territory licensing board and agencies for all 59 US states and territories that cover almost all. I know there's probably some professions out there that are hiding in the shadows that we didn't get, but it's definitely going to give you the majority of professions and occupations, what those licensing boards and agencies are. So right now that's available on past MEC convening page, but we are working on updating that, and the updated version will be available here at some point this summer. So I know that's not useful for you right in this moment, but you can use our version from last July that's available on the MEC past convening page for one of our webinars that we did last year. Great. Any other questions coming in the chat?
Nothing in the chat right now. Some information, research tools on the SAN web page requires a member login. That's too bad. But no
Go ahead,
question.
Lisa. I see a hand up.
So I was able to sit in on the session you did in the fall, and I remember there being something stated using the example of nursing, right? If you had an on-campus nursing program, but one of those nursing students took an online program, and how that, or took an online course, and how that might be impacted by this whole thing. Has that kind of gotten resolved? Did I misunderstand what was being said? Like, was there clarification on that?
Yeah, so I don't think you misunderstood, Lisa, and actually I didn't even touch on the distance education definition in my little overview today. And that's really because I think the focus on distance education is a little bit of a sidetrack for this issue. So
Okay.
the key is really about your student location policy and where that location policy places students at the time of initial enrollment. So if you have a face-to-face on-campus program and your students are going to be moving to Illinois somewhere on your campus or nearby to enroll and complete that program, they're going to be taking, again, their classes are mostly all going to be on your campus face-to-face, but they have, let's say, one class they're doing online during that first term of enrollment. If your student location policy is crafted and set up in such a way that you're treating any student who's coming onto your campus as located in Illinois, then that distance education question or potential issue becomes much less significant, if that makes sense. So if you're not tracking what I'm saying for others, if you haven't heard this before, the Department of Education staff have indicated that the definition they're applying for distance education student in the new PPA certification regulation is the one that they put out in the May 2023 Dear Colleague letter that's really focused on accreditation and distance education. But within that letter, it says if a student's taking one or more class through distance education then they're considered a distance education student. So Department of Education staff has said, look, we're going to apply that definition here. So if you have a prospective student who's going to take one or more class online during that first term of enrollment in the licensure program, then they'd be considered a distance education student for these purposes. And what that triggers is under the new PPA certification regulation language, you have to be able to certify that your program meets the educational requirements where the institution is located and where your distance education students are located. So that's where distance education comes in. I've just found that the more people focus on that piece, kind of the more lost they get in the trees, right? So that distance education, that one or more class during the first term of enrollment could be a consideration, but I think for most institutions and programs, if you just think about where are our students located based on what our student location policy says, that's going to get you on the right track for compliance. Thank you for bringing that up, Lisa, because I neglected to dive into the distance education piece before. And again, as I mentioned, really this applies to all of your programs. You could have scenarios where this distance education definition may become a factor, but in the most part, as long as you're focusing on what your student location policy says, where those students are located and that you're meeting the education requirements where they're located, that's going to cover, I think, your bases for what the department expects. Any other questions? Anyone want to ask in video or audio?
So I'll just ask one quick question. So in essence, that means that you can't, in your student location policy, say that we are going to use, just say for instance, their mailing address. But then if they don't provide that, then we'll use their parents' address. And I'm just making up something.
Sure. Yeah, so if your question is, LaTanya, can we use those things? I mean, the answer is yes. So Department of Ed has not, again, they haven't prescribed what a student location policy needs to use in order to determine a student's location. They haven't really even put any limitations really around that, but you have to have a policy in place where you are using that, whatever those criteria are that you create to determine a student's location. And so some institutions have location policies now that they've had in place since 2020, where they are connected to, the address that a student inputs into their student information system as their local address or as their mailing address, whatever that's categorized as. And an institution can continue to use that as your student location policy. Of course, you would just need to think through how that's going to be applied and how you'll have to be able to using that in your certify responsibility starting July 1st and later. Yeah. So it could create some new challenges or new things to think through as you're, revising processes to prepare for this certify responsibility and the disclosures.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Chris, Sarah has a question. First, a statement. Illinois is a great supporter of military-connected students. How would this apply to them and their spouses?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So Department of Education has not provided any sort of special considerations or exceptions for military-affiliated students. And so if they're enrolling in one of your Title IV programs, that's a licensure program, all of this applies to them in the same way, which means if you have a military affiliated student who's located in a does not meet or not determined state or territory at the time of initial enrollment, you would need to get a written attestation from them in order to enroll in your program. And I know that that could be a challenge. Again, the written attestation itself needs to clearly identify one state or territory where your program meets the education requirements, where that student plans to seek licensure employment after graduating. Our military affiliated learners don't know where they're going to be, in the next 5+ years or less even. So it can be a challenge to think about how they could actually attest to that. But unfortunately, again, we don't have, at this point anyway, any sort of special considerations. I know that people have been raising this to Department of Education. And so again, maybe in this written guidance, they'll provide something additional or something else where there would be some kind of consideration for military learners. But at this point, they have not indicated that. In fact, they've indicated the opposite, that every student needs to be treated the same way and these regulations apply consistently. no matter if they're military or not.
We have a follow-up question to that. If they are based overseas, then what would need to be done?
Right. So the language in this regulation is very specific about states, and that's with the capital S. That is defined in these Title IV regulations to be the 59 US states and territories. So if you have a student, if they're military affiliated or otherwise, that are located at some international address, then you would not need to worry about if it's meeting educational requirements where they're located. They're not located in a state or territory. So I think, this is kind of it could bring up some weird situations, right? If you have US citizens who are temporarily living outside of the US, but ultimately plan to come back and seek a license, like there are still things that institutions probably want to consider doing, which may not technically be required under these Title IV disclosure requirements and certifying requirements. So you may still want to consider having some sort of information provided to those students, even if they have an international address. In particular, if the plan would be to come to the US and seek a license somewhere after completing the program. And again, I know that thinking about, okay, would they be coming onto my campus for a program versus is this a fully online program and they're going to continue? There's a lot of considerations here when you're thinking through these, but technically the Title IV regulations apply only to that particular state, again, capital S, which includes 59 US states and territories where your students are located.
Chris, can you speak to international student enrollment? And if the student resides outside the country, what then?
Yeah, so I think I probably just covered it, but I guess even more specifically, that would apply to non-US citizens, also with an international address or outside of the US address. I will say, knowing, having read and worked with some institutions on their student location policy, some are choosing to put references to international students in their student location policy. So to put some clarification or limitations around that, because I know there's also a connection around addresses and visa requirements, right? And so you don't want to create a scenario where you are setting an international student, up for failure, if you will, because of the connection here with visa requirements. So think about that in particular if you have significant number of international students who would actually be coming onto your campus, to enroll in the program and to complete it. Make sure that there's not going to be a conflict there for those immigration purposes. Another potential conflict, just while I'm talking about it for student location policy, people often ask, well, what about our in-state tuition considerations? We know that some institutions are, again, putting some clarity, putting some definitions in their student location policy that it's not for tuition residency purposes, right? Like there's a separate policy and process that applies there, but this student location policy is in particular for these licensure compliance purposes. You can even list in the location policy itself a reference to the federal Title IV regulations. Like you can cite back to that section of the code just to make it very clear, like this is what we're doing with this policy. And you could still have other things in place that are setting your students' locations for other purposes like tuition residency or international students for visa purposes, that type of thing. All right, well, I see we're about at 3:30, so it's probably a good time to shift gears. We do have a poll question. If you are so inclined and would be willing to participate, we would appreciate it. So if you haven't used Slido before, you can scan that QR code that you see on the screen now, and it'll take you right to the poll where you can answer what is your biggest challenge with implementing these regulations, in particular these changes for July 1. You can also just go to their website, slido.com, and put in number 2561206, you'll see the same question. So you can either use your mobile phone or other mobile device and scan the QR code, or go ahead and go to slido.com on your computer, type in 2561206. And in just a moment, Nan will present the results here so you can see those coming in real time as you're taking the poll.
Hello. I'm on a
right.
webinar.
So thank you. We've got some answers coming in.
I'm on a webinar.
Looks like the biggest challenge right now so far with the results coming in is related to the research. Completing that research of other states' educational requirements, comparing your programs to those requirements is also a challenge. And some of you aren't sure yet because you haven't really gotten started on this work. Appreciate you being here today. Hopefully provide some good resources and information to help get you started. So we'll wait just maybe 5 more seconds here, then we can move on. But I'll notice, again, pretty good mix of challenges here that you all are facing. And I know with the poll, we only let you choose one. So some of these may be, more than one challenge for some of you, but we're only letting you choose one in this particular poll as the biggest or greatest challenge. All right. Well, thank you for participating in that. It does look like the largest challenge winner is researching those educational requirements in other states and territories, which probably is a good place to start with our discussion. So as I mentioned before, we wanted to spend some time together this afternoon, really talking to each other, but mostly not me talking. So I'd love to hear you all share about some of these discussion questions. And the first one that I have is related to that research process, completing that research. So is anyone willing to share how your institution has been tackling that, or what your plans are for how to tackle that in the next few months? Really digging in and doing that research into other states' requirements for licensure.
Hi, Chris. Tammy Moore here.
Hi, Tammy.
I've been working closely with you guys, and so I'm new to my role here. And one of what I'm doing now, as far as reviewing the different requirements, is basically setting up an Excel template. We purchased the bookmark, and so I just downloaded all the data for each program, and I lay it out and highlight certain areas for the faculty to actually go through and conduct the review. So in a sense, I'm their assistant, if you will. I'm just making sure, the information is truncated for them, so they get a quick review and I can go live with it. And that seems to be working out pretty well.
Great. Thank you, Tammy. Good to see you. Yes.
Same.
And Dr. Moore just referenced the bookmark, which is online database of educational requirements that Higher Education Licensure Pros has created that we offer to institutions for a fee who would like to access it. So we've gone through and researched what the requirements are in all 59 states and territories. I think we're pretty close to 75 license types now. And so that's kind of meant to be a one-stop resource for where you can find information about those license types.
Yeah. And someone asked in the chat, I'm from Southern Illinois University of Edwardsville. And feel free to reach out. And I'm new. I guess you could, even if you've been in this role 5 or 10 years, you're new too because of all these changes. So if there's any questions or anything I could provide, I'm happy to do so.
Great. Thank you so much. Love the collaborative spirit. I think that that's what I appreciate about this space. Having worked for an institution before, you know, we're all kind of ultimately in the same boat, right? So the more we can try to help each other, um, it's definitely good to collaborate when we can. Anybody else want to share how you're tackling this for your institution or how you're planning to tackle it in the future?
Yes, this is Gretchen. One thing that I don't know if this group wants to know, but there's an organization called the State Authorization Network, and I know you've worked closely with them, but if folks aren't familiar with that group, they do a lot of interpretation of the federal regulations and help advocate and help communicate those different changes federally. So at the U of I, we've been looking at this for a long time, but it is something that I think could be useful to the group. If you're interested in knowing that, I can put them in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Gretchen. And again, WCET is the sponsoring entity, which is, you know, the Western region, but the State Authorization Network is open to the whole US, all institutions, no matter where you are. And they do have some really great resources related to licensure, but even more broadly around, you know, state authorization, the ability to operate your programs across state lines. So thanks for including that, Gretchen. I guess I'll throw out another question then, see if anybody wants to bite on this one. I mentioned about initial enrollment, you know, so initial enrollment, again, we don't have a clear dictated point in time from the US Department of Ed for these purposes on what that needs to be. So there's some flexibility here for institutions to set your own point in time of initial enrollment. Anybody want to share like what is your time frame on that, and maybe why you came to that conclusion for your institution?
I'm sure Chris is still listening. He just went off camera for a moment, but
Yep. Sorry, my kid just got home and our dogs started going berserk, just getting back home from school. So
Chris also has a great capacity to wait. for,
I do. I told the last, we've been doing these state sessions for all of the states in MEX region. And so I told the last group that, you know, I did go to law school and I had several professors who would just stand there and look at all of us and wait for someone to answer. So I picked up on that skill. I'm okay with silence. I can sit and wait for somebody to bring forward an answer. Well, not seeing any volunteers, and I'm not going to call on you like my law school professors would have, because I'm not that cruel. But things to think about with initial enrollment. Again, you have some flexibility here. Some institutions are setting it with a point in time very close to the first day of class of that start of the term, that first term in the licensure program. Others are setting it way back when someone's initially inquiring, like an application, like they're putting it as part of their application process. Something in there is kind of triggering this initial enrollment. And then we've got people who are setting it with registering for classes and anything really in between those phases. So there's lots of options, but there are definitely things to consider with any one of those, where it can create some different types of challenges or things that you would need to work through at your institution. So if you do it closer to the first day of classes, just keep in mind that you can only enroll students located in a MEET state or territory, or if they do that written attestation. So you'd probably want to have some sort of exchange of information happening with students much earlier that are in those does not meet or not determined locations, so that they understand what the written attestation process is, why it's required, and that they would have to be able to provide that to you before they can actually start classes and enroll. So again, just keep that in mind, depending on where you're setting it and the point in time. And if you're doing it more on the front end, you could end up securing written attestations from a bunch of students who end up not actually starting your program for that term for whatever reason, right? So you could have people that are kind of still working their way through the admission process if you've already captured those at the point of application, and if they're not admitted right away or they don't want to start that term. So it's kind of a trade-off, and you have to think through current processes around admission and enrollment for your institution, and how adding these in as new factors could create some different challenges to sort through.
This is Mary with Quincy University. We're starting to think about initial enrollment because some of our students enroll undecided and then later on declare said major that has a licensure component with it, so that at initial enrollment it might be fine, but then when they declare, has anybody talked about its initial enrollment in the major or program?
So for these regulations, Mary, it is connected to the licensure program, not necessarily institutional enrollment, which that is a really important distinction.
Okay.
So yeah, that's good to be thinking through that. I know, again, one of these other sessions we've done with another MEC region state, people were talking about for certain programs, like a pre-nursing type of program, or pre-teacher preparation programs, that some people are treating those pre-programs again as like they're going to still do some disclosure or do some educating about those students, even though they technically don't have to do these disclosures yet until they're enrolled in the licensure program. But it's because they don't want to set up a situation where students have that intention of enrolling in the nursing program in year 2 or 3, but they can't formally do that until then. So thinking about those things too, how that works at your institution, even with the pre-professional programs, in addition to all those undeclared people who may eventually want to declare into a licensure major, and what that could look like.
So just to clarify, and I really appreciate what you shared, initial enrollment does kind of have a definition of when I've enrolled inside of that licensure program. I'm going to be a special ed teacher. I enroll into that program. That's a program that leads to licensure. So it's when the actual program is started. So we couldn't say, unless, well, I guess you could if you only enrolled into schools and didn't have undecided. I think I answered my own question there, but it really is when you start that program, period, end of sentence, right?
Yeah, the responsibility kicks in relation to the licensure program, not necessarily enrollment at the institution. So those could be the same point in time, right? for students, but you could have these scenarios where they're not. If you have undeclared majors or pre-professional licensing degrees, or if you just, you got students who come in for one licensure program and then they switch at some point to another licensure program, you would have two responsibilities for that student because it's connected to enrollment in the licensure program itself.
Understood. And that helps because that's the moving target I think we're talking about that I have the most concern about is the undecided student who ends up in a licensure program or change that licensure program. And I think what you've said before, that location policy is going to be key in kind of setting the tone for that.
Yep, absolutely. You're right. So what does your student location policy say for all the different scenarios, right? Like for someone coming in as a prospective student, how are you going to treat them as where they're located? Are you keying it to an address that they're inputting into the application? Are you connecting it to something else? If it's a face-to-face on-campus program and they'll be relocating to somewhere on or very close to your campus in Illinois, right? Are you going to treat them as an Illinois student? Again, at that point of initial enrollment, whatever that point is. So yeah, it kind of all does come back to student location policy for a lot of these considerations, which is why it's even more important now than it has been under these 2020 disclosure regulations.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for your question. Kind of along those lines, what I just said, I'll throw out this question. Are any of you currently working to revise your student location policy, or have you already done so? That you're providing some sort of considerations for those students who will be relocating to your campus or somewhere very close to do your face-to-face program?
Chris, this is Gretchen. Yeah, we're working on ours, but it's not ready yet.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen. Would you mind sharing just a little about kind of what that work process has been? I'm guessing that you're partnering with different folks to try to do that. You're not just in your office by yourself, but maybe that's a part of it too, but might be helpful for people who haven't really thought about this yet. Like, who do they need to bring into these conversations and get the buy-in from before they actually make policy revisions or set up the policy?
Yes, our provost offices, along with our compliance offices, are working together to try to develop some language to determine kind of how to move forward. And it's still kind of under legal review right now, so we don't have really anything we can share with others. But, we're just trying to figure out what the regulations are requiring and then trying to figure out how to address it in a way that makes the most sense. A lot of our programs are face-to-face as opposed to online programs. So the initial enrollment would be really more specific to the students that are going to be on the campus as opposed to in other states. And so the definition of the student location policy is sort of key in figuring out how to manage this regulation, if that makes sense.
Yep, totally. And thanks for sharing kind of that process and who you've been working with. You made a great point. Your policy is currently under review by your counsel's office. And this is one of those things where I think it is important to have your counsel weigh in for you on, understanding what the different options for student location determination mean and how they're being applied and kind of what risks that could be creating for the institution in different areas. Have a good handle on that. So thank you for sharing. Anybody else currently working on revisions to your student location policy or drafting that policy for the first time?
I will say one more thing, Chris, sorry. We reached out to Chris and Nan really early on. I don't even remember when, but it's been a while. And so they actually were really helpful too in providing some guidance on like student location policies and things of that nature. So like using those resources of Nan and Chris and MEC and SAN network, I think are all helpful too.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen. Yeah, again, collaborating, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you all have to make these decisions for your institution, but you definitely can rely on information from others that are going through the same thing or that are trying to support institutions doing that work, like us and SAN and others. So,
Along those same lines, Mike posted, is there a repository of student location policies or examples that colleagues could share? Anyone willing to share or bring them together for Illinois education institutions?
This is Gretchen one more time, but like I asked the same question and it doesn't seem like a lot of people are interested in sharing their location policies, that I haven't really seen too many. So I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's more of a legal document that they're worried about sharing it, but I've not had great success in getting things shared with me.
yeah, and I'm not aware of a repository that exists yet. Nan and I were out in Charleston, South Carolina, a couple of weeks ago for a conference by an organization called NASAPS. They also partner with WCAT State Authorization Network, so it's kind of a joint conference, if you will. I know there were a couple of groups there at the conference that were asking that people would share, and so there could be some repositories in the future. Nothing that's available yet. But again, if you're a member of WCET SAN, or even if you're not a member yet, I think they'll probably be making some information available through some channels that way. And then certainly you can share with each other, right, if you want to. One reason why MEC set up these sessions by state is just, because then you do have that geographic affinity, and it's a smaller group. So if you all want to figure out ways that you can share information more easily or in different ways amongst yourselves, please feel free to do that too. All right, we still have a little bit of time, so I'll throw out another question. Then I'm curious on the written attestation process. So if any of you have started working with your admissions or enrollment teams to figure out how you're going to create that new exception process that the department's put into place as a requirement if you want to enroll a student located in a does not meet or not determined state or territory, or even if you've started working on the actual kind of form or language, whatever is going to be part of that written attestation. Curious if anybody's started down that road yet.
Chris, this is Gretchen again. We are working on ours right now. It's the same process with working with our compliance officers, working with our associate provosts, and then working with our attorneys to finalize it.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen.
Well, Sarah Appel has graciously volunteered to send along any student location policies that are shared. So a few of them have been shared in the chat or send directly to Sarah. And thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome. And I'll just collect those and make them accessible to our friends here in Illinois.
Anybody else want to share your plans or thoughts around the written attestation process? All right, not seeing any hands fly up or things in the chat. I think we'll move on. We are almost at the end of our official time together for the day. So we have another poll question here for you. So, sorry, I just realized that I didn't do something that I needed to do on my end.
Will it still work for people though to,
Now it will. Go ahead. Yep.
now it will, okay, great.
I just had to flip one thing over. So if you want to go to slido.com again and put in 2561206, you can also scan that QR code from your mobile or other device and take it there. And then we can show these results here in a moment. But this one, we're asking you to put in a couple words or a short phrase. What's your first order of business after this meeting? So what are you going to start on tomorrow with this work? Appreciate you putting your responses in there. Great, so we've got some responses coming in already. You'll see those continue to populate here as you're all responding. See a couple people are gonna set a meeting right away. So it is a good idea. Get your team in place, get the right people at the table so that everyone understands the importance of this and the work that's ahead, work that's required. Somebody's in the middle of working on accounting, so I'm gonna keep working on that tomorrow. That's good. That's good.
And Chris, we've not had anybody say run away or run the other direction. So you know what? We are doing so good with our folks at SARA. So very proud of you guys for taking on the challenge.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of those things where it would be much easier to run away, right? So let somebody else deal with this. But again, we know that for most of you, this is just one sliver of your responsibilities, and you have many other things that you are charged with on a day-to-day basis. So we do understand that it can be a tremendous amount of work. It can feel overwhelming, but you can do this, right? It is manageable. You just have to make that plan. So people who are saying, create our plan, come together with the team, set up our plan, that's perfect. You can do it. It's a challenge, but we know you can, and we're here to help as we can. So feel free to reach out to us with questions. If you'd like more information about the services we provide to institutions, of course, feel free to email us or find us on our website. We're happy to share that with you.
Thank you, Nan and Chris, for just another wonderful session today. Again, I'll be working with our communications director to have the recording and the slides up. And as soon as those are done, I'll make sure to send a link to all of those resources as well. Again, thank you for joining us, and good luck. If there's anything that you all need, please feel free to reach out to us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.